So welcome everybody to tonight's author series. And I'm so grateful to have Anita Hannig. And Anita, if I've mispronounced your name, please pronounce it correctly when you start to speak. And Anita's book, The Day I Die. For those of you that are not familiar with the foundation, I just want to say that the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation is a nonprofit organization that's inspired by the life of psychiatrist, humanitarian, and hospice pioneer, Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. It's in the spirit of embracing all of life, which includes death, that we further her mission and vision through collaborations, education, and advocacy. And I also just want to say, because people have asked about this, that when we present a speaker, my goal here is to present as wide and diverse and as many opportunities for people to engage in what is available to people at end of life and to better understand that. It doesn't mean that the foundation necessarily promotes or is involved. I know earlier this month we had Dan Diaz and the medical aid in dying, and a couple of people emailed about that. Our goal is to provide education. It's not to promote or to say no to anything. People have every opportunity to make their own decisions once they have all of the information that we have available. So thank you. I just wanted to say that, and I'm so grateful. Hello, Jeffrey, I see you waving there. I want to just welcome all of you. If anybody would like to put up in the chat where it is they're zooming in from, I always find that fascinating. We have a large community here in Anita of people from sometimes around the world, and we'll be sending this out to all 185 people that registered for this talk, even though some of them cannot be here right now, and welcome to you all. At this point, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Anita. Her book was brought to my attention by a couple of friends, and I was so happy to see that this book has come out. Anita is an associate professor of anthropology at Brandeis University, where she teaches classes on medicine, religion, gender, and death and dying. Her work explores the cultural dimensions of medicine with a particular focus on life's bookends, both birth and death. In recent years, she's emerged as a leading voice on death literacy and education in the United States, appearing on podcasts and at community events that tackle America's changing relationship with death. In 2015, Anita launched a long-term ethnographic research project on medical aid in dying in the United States. This project asked how assisted dying is transforming the way Americans die. Anita has spent hundreds of hours talking with patients, families, physicians, lawmakers, and activists across the US. And as part of her research, she also served as a hospice volunteer. So dear to my heart, I was a hospice volunteer coordinator for 24 years, so thank you. And sat in on various court cases and public hearings. Her primary mission was to move beyond the polarizing national debate by uncovering people's real life experiences with these assisted dying laws. And this resulted in the book that we are going to hear about tonight. And without any further ado, there it is, The Day I Die. I'm going to spotlight you. And thank you so much for being with us, Anita. I'm going to remove myself and just turn this over to you. For those that are not familiar with our format, we generally have about an hour listening to the speaker, who will be also, Anita's presenting some slides about her research, and we'll be reading a bit from her book, I believe. And then the last 30 minutes are Q&A. And I would encourage anybody who is interested in asking a question and may not remember it for 90 minutes, feel free to put it up in the chat, preface it by saying question. That makes it much easier for me to follow. And there'll also be a time towards the end for the brave souls that want to raise your hand, and I'll tell people how they can do that later if you're not familiar with the hand raising function here on Zoom. So thank you so much, everybody. And Anita, thank you for your time with us right now.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you to all of you for joining us on this perfectly pleasant Tuesday afternoon here in Portland, Oregon, to talk about death and dying. And I know all of you are very used to talking about the subject, so I'm especially excited because I love chatting with people who have thought about these things and who are curious about what awaits us towards the end of our lives. And this is such an amazing forum to be able to share some ideas. And I'm so grateful to the foundation for hosting. And I wanted to, before I start, I wanted to give a special thanks to the patients and families who trusted me with their stories in this book. It's been an absolute honor to be able to share their journeys in my book and also bear witness to some of the pathways of many others who didn't make it into the pages. If you're wondering about the accent, it's German. So if that was your first question, now you have to think of a second one. I just wanted to preface that. Also, I'm going to probably be a little bit less than an hour to leave more room for questions, because I find that this topic especially always has more questions than there are answers. So I want to make sure we have ample time to get to all of your questions. And so I will say just a couple of things to orient us, and then I would like to share a passage from the book that's especially dear to my heart. And that particular passage is not so much about grief. And I know the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation is an expert in grief and grief-related things. And we can talk about that during the Q&A, what I'm not talking about in this passage. But there's a whole way in which bereavement is different for people or for families whose loved one underwent an assisted death in very interesting ways. I talk about it in the book. For those of you who've read it, they know about it. But for those of you who haven't yet, I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So without further ado, I think let's get started. I might go a little bit into teacher mode because that's what I'm most familiar with. So, but hopefully this will be engaging, entertaining for you when I do. And if you hear any background noises, that's my baby who's teething right now, desperately trying to hang on to her babysitter, who is not as familiar with her yet. So we'll see, fingers crossed. So I began research into this topic in 2015 and kind of fell into this research by accident. I don't know how many of you are familiar, maybe you could raise your hands if you're familiar with the film How to Die in Oregon. It's an amazing documentary on assisted dying. Still, I think the best documentary out there. It came out in 2011 and it got awards at Sundance and things. And it's just a fantastic documentary. And I ended up showing that documentary in my medicine and religion class at Brandeis University. And it's called How to Die in Oregon by Peter Richardson. And just kind of immediately got hooked. Up until that point, all my research had been on birth. And Susan mentioned, I'm interested in the bookends of life. And so I had done a lot of research on birthing and birthing complications in Ethiopia. And I had done kind of the classical thing that anthropologists do. We go to foreign lands and study a culture that's very different from our own. And so I was really focused on women's experiences in far-flung regions of Ethiopia with childbirth complications. And so in some ways, when I started this research, I thought, oh, what could be more fitting than going to the other end of the spectrum, something so different from birth. And of course, and I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A, I found out later that talking about death and talking about birth are actually so similar and in ways that I hadn't anticipated, but that were actually really fruitful for the research. But I began this research in earnest in 2015. And at the time, Massachusetts was trying to pass an assisted dying law. And there was a public hearing at the State House in Boston. And I ended up attending that and chatted with a lot of people who were at the hearing, including Dan Diaz, actually, who came to the hearing, and immediately got connected to this very rich network of assisted dying activists from both ends. And just started getting my first interviews and realized very quickly that if I really wanted to do an anthropological project, I would have to go into states where assisted dying is already legal. And at the time, Oregon and Washington State had the longest experiences with assisted dying. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go back to Oregon. I went to college out here. I went to Reed College here in Portland, and I'd worked for this NGO called Mercy Corps, and I'd been abroad with them. So I thought, oh, I'm just going to go back to Oregon, live there for a while. And I ended up doing years of research on this topic. And as Susan said, really wanted to understand how assisted dying transformed how Americans died. And fast forward to 2022, and Massachusetts is still trying to pass an assisted dying bill. Even as we speak, they're trying to get this law voted out of committee so that the Senate and the House can vote on it, and it's not looking super good. So nothing has changed in Massachusetts, even though they've tried almost every year or every second year to introduce a bill. But there's a lot of pushback, and I'm happy to talk about that during the Q&A, where the pushback comes from and what the future of assisted dying laws hold. And I know a lot of people might have questions around, well, now that the Supreme Court is going after abortion, could they go after assisted dying? And I'm happy to chat about that during the Q&A. So we now live in a country where 1 in 5 Americans, about 22%, has access to an assisted death. It has been legalized, I would say, predominantly in blue states, but then you have Montana, which is kind of the exception, because in Montana, assisted dying is not illegal, but it's also, there's no positive law. But technically, you wouldn't get in trouble if you pursued an assisted death in Montana. All the other states, I could rattle them down really quickly, are Washington State, Oregon, California, Hawaii, Colorado, New Mexico, just going in my map, New Jersey, Maine, Washington, D.C., Vermont. Did I say Maine? Yes. New Jersey. And that's it. So it's 11 jurisdictions total. Yes, going after abortion is my bias. I'm going to be totally honest about that. So what I ended up doing with this research is I took an immersive anthropological approach. So what that means is that I embedded myself into the communities that I was studying. Rather than just conducting surveys or conducting one-off interviews, I actually ended up really becoming a part of the people of people's families who were pursuing and seeking out an assisted death. I was a hospice volunteer here in Portland, Oregon for 8 months to really understand how end-of-life decisions get made. And in order to do that, I really wanted to see from the inside what some of the considerations are, how people, what kind of choices people feel they have when it gets closer to the end, and what the level of acceptance is in the way that people approach that. And I ended up getting passed around, as one does when you start doing research, from one person to the next who says, oh, I know so-and-so, you should talk to XYZ. And eventually, some of the doctors who were working here in Oregon and Washington, who were working in California actually with assisted dying patients, ended up referring me to some of their patients who had indicated that they really wanted to be part of something larger, or wanted their death to mean more than it meant to them and their family, for advocacy purposes and to further research. So those were the people who allowed me into their lives. Those were the people who allowed me to shadow their deaths. And the book really talks about that. And I became, when you go to these events, it's very difficult to just sit there and be a passive bystander. And that was never my goal. As anthropologists, we don't approach a situation like a journalist would. We don't assume that we are unbiased, because you already carry, as a person, you already carry, in my case, almost 40 years of experience being in the world and looking at the world through a certain lens, and you're bringing that lens to any sort of research that you go to. And anthropologists say it's really important to be upfront about that, because you're filtering everything you're seeing, and your presence in the room changes what is happening. And journalists sometimes try to pretend it doesn't, that they're just kind of a fly on the wall and they're sitting there and nobody pays attention. But I'm not sure that that's true, because in each of the deaths that I was able to attend, I took on certain roles that needed to be taken on. If it was taking a picture of the family, if it was opening up the capsules, if it was certain other things that just really were involved, that became part of carrying that person over the threshold. And really, if you think about that as a group effort, that's kind of really how it felt at the moment. So you don't just go there with a notepad. I didn't actually take notes. This was all mental, mental notes, and then I went home and I wrote everything down that I remembered. And because it's also a very sacred space to be invited into that space of death. And it's a very humbling experience. And so it would have felt very off-putting to sit there with a notepad or to not be part exactly of what is happening. So for those of you who have started to read The Day I Die, you can see right from the first scene that it describes my getting ready for Ken's death and not knowing what to wear to such an occasion, because Ken had made it very clear before that he didn't want this to be a somber affair. He wanted this to be a celebration of his life, and he didn't want this to be, like a very serious and sort of tear-filled event. I mean, it ended up being both. But so how do you honor that? But how do you also honor the gravity of the situation, that somebody is taking their life into their own hands? So I think that's potentially what differentiates my approach from that of many journalists, I would say, although other journalists might also become immersive. But my methodology as an anthropologist has always been, from my discipline, in order to study human difference in all of its forms, you immerse yourself in what people are doing, and you do what they do, and you listen to what they say. So I wanted to read an excerpt tonight of some of the rituals that have emerged as part of assisted dying. And what's really struck me as I began this research is that for the first time, almost, you could pretty much say for the first time in human history, outside of hospitals, you now have assisted dying basically gives you the opportunity to time death and to anticipate death in ways that you just wouldn't have able to do before. And that anticipation, or that ability to prepare and say goodbye and all of those things, have led to really important rituals that families have come up with as they usher somebody out and over the threshold. And not all families do that, but I've certainly seen some sort of, even a small thing that families kind of devised to, that was meaningful to them, that was meaningful to the person who was choosing this path, to basically lift them over the threshold and let them go. And in the case that I'm going to write about, there was this really beautiful ritual. And it really, as an anthropologist, of course, my mind immediately gravitated towards that, because if we think about rituals, they mark passages, they mark, they divide, they separate the ordinary everyday from the extraordinary. And they show the people around us that something extraordinary is about to take place. And in every ritual, you go from it's a change of state, it's a change of status, right? So somebody used to be one thing, and through the ritual, they become somebody else or something else. So if you think about weddings, baptisms, those kinds of things, right? There are always a lot of ritualistic components. And so there are with death. And in most other cases, when it's not clear, let's say somebody's on hospice or dies in the hospital, it's not always clear when somebody will die, or even sometimes where and how. And with assisted dying, that guesswork has been taken out. And it has, and I'm not saying it's a good or bad thing, it just is, because somebody can anticipate when they're going to leave the earth. And so they can say, okay, on Monday at 5, I know I will draw my last breath. So knowing that, what do I want to do to prepare for that? And what is my family going to do? So for those of you who have the book, actually, I'm going to share, so while I'm reading this, I am just going to share a couple of slides, and there's one passage from this reading that I'm wondering if, Susan, do you think it would be disruptive if everybody unmuted themselves to read this poem aloud with me?
I have been in rooms where we have tried to do this, and it's very difficult. If you've had success doing it, I can ask people that would like to join to do this, and we'll just see what happens. And if it's too disruptive, you could just read it again when we've completed this part of it.
Okay.
It is disruptive. It is.
It is disruptive.
Doesn't work here.
Okay,
People talk at different levels, different.
Okay,
speeds.
Jeffrey, we've got it. Thank
Got
you.
it. Thank you.
so maybe what I will do is I will show you the poem on the slide and you can read along with your eyes.
Yes, thank you, Sky.
Okay.
And yes, thank you, Anita. Very good suggestions.
Okay, great. So for those of you who have the book in front of you, or I will start reading on page 25 and at 225, and I will give you a little bit of background. But let me share my screen. Can everybody see that? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to read an excerpt from chapter 10. It's called Crossing Over. And to set the scene a little bit, this chapter specifically talks about some of the new rituals that have emerged around assisted deaths because of the predictability of the way somebody dies. And so the chapter kind of discusses that and then goes into Jean's case. And Jean is an 88-year-old woman who, when I met her, was suffering from a combination of life-threatening conditions, including severe peripheral, I can never pronounce this, peripheral arterial disease, which is a narrowing of the arteries that reduces blood flow to the arms and legs. And when I met her, she felt that she was merely surviving, but no longer living. And she was already enrolled on hospice. She had a life expectancy of less than 6 months. And End of Life Choices Oregon, which is is an organization of volunteer doctors and volunteers that goes and supports people in having an assisted death here in Oregon. I'm happy to talk about this more later. And Dr. Mark Rarick was the primary doctor who had prescribed Jean's life-ending medication, and her secondary doctor, I'm not sure exactly who it was now, had already signed off on everything. So Jean was ready to go, and she had invited all her kids, except one who was on the East Coast, who was still, until the day of her death, still opposed her wish to die, and who wanted to prevent his mother from doing it, but was unsuccessful, essentially. So he didn't choose to come, but her 4 other kids were there, and then her best friend, Lloyd, was also there. So I'm going to start reading. I'm hoping you can hear me okay. And when we get to the poem, I will just kind of tell you how we did it the day of, and you can just silently follow along, okay? All right. The day of Jean's death, her prescribing physician called to let me know that she would proceed with her plan. That morning, he had dropped by her apartment to make sure she was still able to articulate with absolute clarity that she wanted to die. Dr. Rarick needed to be certain that Jean's budding dementia wasn't getting in the way of her decision-making ability. Jean had answered all his questions to his satisfaction. When Rarick, a volunteer, and I walked up to the entrance of Jean's building later that afternoon, her 3 daughters were milling around outside, waving and smiling when they saw us approach. Jean had sent Elise, Valerie, and Valerie's twin sister Liz out to the lobby to wait for us. She thought it would speed things up if someone was actively waiting. As the sisters steered us past the sign-in desk, Elise told me that in the last couple of days, her mother had traded her wheelchair back in for her walker and her speech had cleared up. She's been roaring down the hallways with her walker, said Elise, her round eyes gleaming. It's her body's last gasp. The prospect of her death seemed to have finally put Jean's mind at ease. Nick Gideons, a family medicine doctor who frequently takes assisted dying cases, says that's not uncommon. Once they secure the prescription for the lethal drugs, even very sick patients frequently experience an uptick in morale and physical ability. Quote, the idea that once people have the prescription, they live longer because they have been empowered, I really believe that's true. Am I a better skier because I'm wearing a helmet? No, but I'm more confident. Often that empowerment leads to a little more eating and drinking or searching out enjoyable activities, without the fear that it'll be a badly placed gamble that will leave them in a bad situation. The minute we entered Jean's apartment, I understood what Gideon's meant. There was Jean, surrounded by bouquets of flowers, sitting in a purple armchair in violet slacks, striped purple socks, a creamy white blouse, and a peach vest. Her curly gray hair was washed and delicately coiffed, offset by silvery earrings and a big bangled necklace. Jean beamed like a schoolgirl on the first day of class. "Let's do this," she said in lieu of a greeting. Jean's apartment had already been stripped down to its basics. She had insisted on purging most of her furniture, save for her bed and an assortment of chairs that stood in a half circle around her armchair. Her other son, Daniel, and Jean's friend, Lloyd, was sitting in two of them. Ever the pragmatist, Jean had peddled off her remaining possessions to family members and random acquaintances. Whoever walked through the door, they weren't allowed to leave without something. She had persuaded Rarick to take one of her decorative African masks. I had left our first meeting with a coffee table book on Nigerian nomads. Now the doctor took a seat across from her. He asked her if she knew what would happen if she took the medication that sat on her kitchen counter. "It will taste bitter, my brain will shut down my breathing, and then I will die," Jean replied, so matter-of-factly she may as well have rattled off a list of the state capitals. I was impressed. Not many patients knew the specifics of how the medication worked. Rarick asked if she wanted to proceed. "Absolutely." Jean flashed the doctor a coquettish smile. She had a habit of flirting with men of a certain social standing, though Rarick, looking straggly and dressed in ill-fitting hiking pants, hardly looked the part. "Are you sure?" he probed. She seemed so upbeat, he needed to be certain. "Yes. The first time since our arrival." The smile slid from Jean's face and her voice turned solemn. "I want to take the medication." Rarick handed her 3 pills to reduce nausea and anxiety, along with a glass of water. For my work with the doctor, I knew that each of these deaths touched him at his core. If assisting someone to die ever became easy for him, he had sworn to himself that he would quit. The bonds that he established with each of his patients ran deep. "Thank you, dear," Jean crooned, batting her eyelashes at the doctor. Rarick and the volunteer disappeared into Jean's bedroom to open up the capsules of Seconal. The rest of us sat down in the chairs facing Jean. Her son Daniel pulled up her favorite songs on his phone. Stevie Wonder, Peggy Lee. With one leg thrown over the other, her white tennis shoes tapping along with the music, Jean snapped her fingers and sang the lyrics she knew. When she was younger, she had played percussion and the piano. "Is that all there is? Is that all there is?" Jean and her daughter Elise belted her favorite Peggy Lee song, an anthem of Jean's mid-adult years. In the summertime, she would open all the doors in their house and, like a teenager, play the record over and over again, twirling her children around the floor until they collapsed. Carried back to those carefree summer days, Elise glanced at her mother. She hadn't been herself in a long time. Especially over the past year, her life had turned into a reverse enactment of Groundhog Day, each day slightly more miserable than the previous. Elise knew how much she wanted out. The resolve her mother felt about her death gave Elise a sense of peace. There would be levity to her loss. "If that's all there is, my friends," Elise picked up the chorus now, her cocked head brushing up against her mother's tresses. "Then let's keep dancing." In between songs, Jean sent me into the bedroom to check on the progress of the medication. Each time I returned with an unsatisfactory report, she raised her eyebrows as if to say, "What's taking so long?" When the powder was ready, 15 minutes before the suggested wait time for the pre-medications was over, Jean's impatience got the better of her. She didn't want to wait any longer. Her daughter scooted her armchair forward and encircled her. Their mother's urgency didn't surprise them at all. When her mind was set on something, there was no stopping her. Jean kissed each of them on the mouth. They told her that they loved her. When it was his turn, her son Daniel broke down crying. Jean tried to comfort him. "It's all right," she said, petting his hand. "It's not all right, but it will be all right." Welling up one by one, the siblings passed the Kleenex box between them, joking that Jean's friend Lloyd was hogging it. For the 4th time that day, Rarick asked if Jean wanted to change her mind. She declined so sharply I wondered if her affection for the doctor was starting to cool. He handed her the lethal dose of barbiturates. She took one sip and pulled away. Her face contorted into a grimace. Oh, that's nasty. Straining, Jean forced down the rest of the drink in 5 big gulps. Rarick refilled the glass with water to pick up the remaining morsels of medication. He wanted to ensure that all the medication would enter her body. Suddenly, Jean erupted into a coughing fit. Her eyes, agape, searched for the doctors. Elise placed her hand on Jean's belly. The twins clasped their mother's shoulders. Rarick told Jean to breathe slowly. Fixating her gaze on the doctor, she took a shallow inhale, followed by a drawn-out exhale. A few seconds later, the coughing sputtered to a halt, and the panic look in Jean's eyes dissipated. The water had just gone down the wrong pipe. Jean lit up again. Take care of each other, she told her children, giving each a final kiss. Wow, that's so bitter, her daughter Liz exclaimed, wiping her mouth. I can't feel my lips. The little bit of seconal left on her mother's lips had been enough for her to taste it. Jean turns towards me. This stuff tastes terrible. Someone really needs to change that, and they should change the name of the law. Death with dignity. What a mouthful. I felt a wave of anxiety pulse through me. I knew that Jean felt strongly about educating people on Oregon's assisted dying law. That's why she had invited me to her death, so I could write about it firsthand. But I couldn't believe that this precious woman who was about to die spent the last few moments of her life on an advocacy pitch. I suspected her daughters had expectations of some meaningful last words from their mother, yet Jean pressed on. There are all these baby boomers who will want a better way to die. Our society doesn't recognize that yet. They will someday. I promised Jean I would do my best. Her mouth curved into a smile and she reclined in her chair. Rarick leaned in to tell Jean a story about his son, who had recently said that the country's next president should be a woman. Her eyes dimming, Jean cast him an approving look. She had long thought so herself. In the middle of his story, Jean floated off to sleep, her head sinking down to her chest. Elise let out a primal sob. Valerie looked much too stunned to cry. The sisters tried to prop their mother's head up with a pillow, but it kept dropping. Rarick recommended that Jean should lie down flat. Elise fumbled to take her mother's oversized earrings off. Valerie removed her glasses. Liz gingerly uncrossed her legs. Her son Daniel scooped up his mother from one side while Rarick held the other. With Elise at the head and Jean's friend Lloyd holding the door, they carried Jean into the bedroom and lowered her onto her twin bed. Jean's family stood quietly in a half circle around her bed, their hands resting on her body. Valerie distributed a call and response poem from a ceremony called Going Westward to the Sunrise. It was an excerpt from Ursula Le Guin's book, Always Coming Home. Earlier that year, the famous science fiction author had died in her home in Portland, and Elise had attended the service where the poem was first read. Jean and Ursula had been neighbors, and Elise thought that reading Ursula's poem at her mom's death would be a fitting way to usher her out. Valerie explained that the living were to read the left side of the poem aloud in unison, pausing after each stanza so that the dying person could answer silently by reciting the lines on the right. We're going to help Mom cross over, Valerie declared. So this is the poem that I'm going to read. And as we were reading it at the death, I'm actually going to pause after each line, not after each stanza. And you'll just have to imagine the right side being read by the person who's dying. Go forward, go forward. We are with you. We are beside you. Go on now, go ahead. Leave us now. It is time to leave us. You are going on. Your feet are on that road. You are going on that road. Do not look back. You are entering. You are achieving. You are arriving. The light is growing. Back here is darkness. Look forward. The doors of the 4 houses are open. Surely they are open. As our chorus voices called out to the departing soul, Elise's hands started moving in the air above her mother. Beginning at the head, her outspread fingers swept the full length of her, releasing Jean's spirit from her body. As we neared the end of the poem, her brush strokes grew heavier and longer, a kind of cleansing clearance. If death was a passage, not an ending, Elise wanted her mother to travel well. Gradually, the color blanched from Jean's face. The intimate circle around her bed unwound, breaking away piece by piece. Rarick reached into his briefcase and retrieved his stethoscope. He pressed the cool metal circle against her blouse. It had been 16 minutes since Jean drank the medication. Her heart is no more, Rarick announced, tears glistening in his eyes. Then he started crying. One by one, Jean's children and Lloyd stepped up to her body and kissed her on the forehead, whispering some final words. When it was my turn, I squeezed her arm and wished her a safe journey. Jean's skin had turned pallid already, but it remained warm to the touch. As I watched Jean upon her bed, surrounded by her children and closest friend, I wondered what she would find in the beyond. I had once asked her what she imagined would happen to her after she died. Though Jean had attended some Unitarian church services in her adult life, she didn't consider herself religious. It's a mystery, she had said, her eyes trained on the dogwood tree outside her window. I wish I knew. Just when I was about to switch off the recorder, Jean piped up again, talking more to herself than to me. I'll run into somebody I know, she murmured. I will look out through the clouds and watch the road go by. So that is the end of that chapter. And I'm now realizing that there's actually a little bit of time. So I was thinking maybe I could start reading a little bit from the grief chapter, because it actually goes back to Elise and Valerie, because I visited them 6 weeks after their mother had passed. I can stop sharing my screen. And I think it's really significant to see what happens to people who go through that kind of an event and how they make sense of it later, because it is so unusual and so unique. And there's a specific way in which the grieving for assisted deaths can sometimes be a little bit different than it is for people whose deaths aren't so expected or are expected in different ways. So if people are still hanging on, then I would just read just 5 more pages of what happened to her daughters, if that's of interest. Okay, good. I'm seeing some thumbs up. Okay. So the next chapter, and it's only going to be 5 pages. It's called Together in Grief. 6 weeks after Jean died, on a sultry summer evening, I met up with 2 of her daughters, Elise and Valerie, over a glass of wine at Elise's house. I was curious how the sisters had processed the experience of watching their mother die and whether they had any regrets. Had assisting in their mother's deaths allayed their feelings of loss and grief, or magnified them? The day of Jean's death, after the doctor and I left, someone called the hospice nurse who had been waiting in the lobby. Jean hadn't wanted her there for her death, so they had agreed that she would come in later to pronounce her death and call the mortuary. Everyone else trickled out until only the hospice nurse and the 3 sisters remained. They spent 2 hours waiting for the mortuary staff to arrive. Elise and Valerie were surprised by how grateful they felt for the extra time. They kept wandering into the bedroom to take in the image of their deceased mother. Being able to be with her body felt really sacred to me, Elise recalled, sitting cross-legged on her sofa next to her sister and cradling a glass of red wine in her lap. I kept going in the other room and looking, and I touched her. It was like a wave just really sinking in that she was gone. It felt like her energy had left her body, and I thought, that's not my mom. Yeah, Valerie nodded. I thought, okay, mom is in the next room, but I didn't think of her as mom. I didn't think of her as anybody. It felt like something had left the building. Elise and Valerie felt pleased with how the mortuary staff handled what came next. They showed up with a gurney draped with a quilt, gently lifted Jean's body onto it, and placed a rose on her pillow. Then they made the bed. The three sisters walked their mother's body out, helped load her onto the vehicle, and watched the van drive away. The morning after Jean's death, her children gathered to tidy up her apartment and clear out the remaining furniture. Then they all dispersed. It was only a day later that the reality of their mother's absence set in. Elise and Valerie were knocked over by a flood of grief. It's one thing to say, yes, that's what she wanted, and yes, she's not suffering anymore, Valerie said, her lips trembling. She pulled a tissue out of a box and balled it up in her hand. But then I missed her so much, and I still do. Losing your mother is so primal, but it helps to know she died the way she did. I think it would have been much more difficult if she had passed away and was by herself. It felt so complete that we were there, said Elise. So not alone, Valerie agreed. And it was so great, Elise's face brightened. It was very sweet. Even when the time and place of someone's death are expected, death itself can come as a shock to those left behind. Still, an assisted death carries a degree of certainty that a home death on hospice does not. By the Bay Health, an hospice organization in Northern California, conducted a 3-year-long study comparing experiences of grief in medically assisted deaths to traditional deaths on hospice. They found that survivors of assisted dying patients reported having less unfinished business and a much greater sense of control over the dying process than those who witnessed an unassisted hospice death. Instances of complicated grief after an assisted death occurred only in 2 instances. When a family member remained opposed to their loved one's decision until the end, such as in Ron's case, her son, or when a loved one planned to take the lethal medication but died before being able to do so. In the latter case, survivors suffered regret from their perceived failure to give their loved one the death they desired. Readying themselves for their mother's death gave Elise and Valerie the opportunity to decide how they wanted to leave things with her. Though the sisters had different fathers and weren't anything alike in appearance or temperament, Valerie lean, petite, and a little reserved, Elise curvy, tall, and gregarious. They were the closest among the siblings, much closer than Valerie was with her twin sister Liz. When they were younger, Valerie, at age 12, helped to raise Elise after their mother tried to devolve herself of the burden of bringing up a 5th child. It took Elise years to work through her feelings of being abandoned by her mother. In the time leading up to her mother's death, Elise reassessed and ultimately reframed their relationship, deciding that she could forgive her. Elise said she felt very complete with her mother at the end. I didn't feel a lot of anger toward her anymore, she said. I felt a lot of love, and I just really wanted an assisted death for her because she was so miserable, and she was not living a life she had ever lived. So there was a lightness to the loss. My mind flashed back to the glimpse of affection between Elise and her mother when they had sung along together to Peggy Lee, minutes before Jean drank the medication. Now that fleeting moment of tenderness between mother and daughter felt even more salient. Valerie chimed in. I felt that too. She wasn't always an easy person to be with. She didn't always act very motherly. But during the period leading up to that day, and certainly on that day, I made a conscious decision to let go of all that. And knowing that her death was coming allowed me to start grieving early. Instead of not being able to say something at the end and regret it later, I was able to say everything. Elise pulled out her phone and scrolled through the pictures. She handed it to me. The picture you took 15 minutes before she passed says it all. The afternoon of Jean's death, the family had posed for a final photograph. The picture shows Jean dressed up and seated in her purple armchair, circled by her children and best friend, everyone radiating contented harmony. You might have thought it was her birthday. Elise said that Jean looked like her mother from 20 years ago. She was so full of life and clear, happy. Families who think they have more time before someone dies sometimes don't do the difficult work of reconciliation. Even on hospice, it's not always possible to be sure when the end is near. When a death is assisted, there's no denying what is about to happen. And while not everything can be solved at the end of someone's life, knowing when a loved one will die brings the chance to try to right past wrongs, to forgive and to be forgiven. Despite the fact that many families find comfort and empowerment in assisting in their loved one's death, they sometimes face a difficult period of bereavement socially. The societal stigma that continues to cling to the idea of ending your own life can prevent families from sharing the details of how their loved one died. Many families fear being judged by relatives, friends, or colleagues for allowing their person to go through with their decision. Bereavement experts refer to this type of mourning as disenfranchised grief, hidden grief that is not fully acknowledged or even allowed by society. Disenfranchised grief describes the feeling that a loved one's death, such as from a suicide, a drug overdose, or a miscarriage, is not seen as worthy of the same grief as other deaths, causing survivors to keep their pain bottled up. Sometimes the criticism survivors absorb from outsiders is subtle. It lives in the silences of things someone doesn't say, in people's offhand gestures or remarks, a body recoiling, the intonation of a word. Elise had expected one of her fellow board members to be supportive when she confided in him about her mother's death. His reaction unsettled her. "My God, I am so sorry," he exclaimed, as if witnessing her mother die had been horrific and traumatizing. Valerie's supervisor at work emitted a hushed groan when she disclosed how her mother had died, offering no condolences for her loss. "After that encounter, I only revealed the details to trusted friends and family," Valerie said now, her mouth setting into a hard line. It added a layer of sadness to expend energy trying to figure out what someone's reaction might be. The experience of Mom's death was so overwhelming that just to say, "my mom died," didn't begin to express how I was feeling. The judgment didn't just come from people outside their family circle. Valerie said she felt shamed by her own family for supporting their mother's wish to die, especially Jean's twin sister, who called Valerie after her death to say that she felt sorry that Jean had to do that. Valerie responded that she didn't feel sorry at all. Put in her mother's position, she would have done the exact same thing. Her aunt didn't say much after that. "I will defend Mom's decision to the day I die," said Valerie, searching for Elise's eyes. Elise reached for her hand. So I think that's probably a good stopping point. The chapter goes on to circle back to some of the other people that I had followed in the book and whose stories I had portrayed. And it circles back to the survivors of those folks to check in with them and see how they were doing and whether or not they still thought that they were still kind of thinking that an assisted death was the best decision for their parent or their or their spouse, actually, in one case. So I think we should open it up. I see a lot of curious faces. I'm sure you have many questions. I'm happy to talk more about other things I learned, or if people have technical questions about the laws. And sometimes I get questions around, is this a party issue? Are these, because mostly blue states have legalized assisted dying, and I can tell you that it's not. But I am just curious where you are, where I'm finding you after reading this, and what you're curious about.
Anita, hi, I'm going to keep you on mute. And if you would like to speak, then there's a way to do that. And please go to the bottom of your screen. There is an opportunity there. Otherwise, we have a bunch of people speaking at the same time. You see a little icon there with a smiley face that says reactions. If you click on that, there's something that says raise hand, and that allows me to see the order in which people are raising their hand. If people are raising their hand like this, I can't see them. I just want to let people know that, because that happens on every workshop. So click on the raise hand icon. If for some reason you can't find that, put something up in the chat, and then we'll have Anita address that. A couple of things I just wanted to say. One was thank you. The stories, I think those personal stories are just incredibly beautiful to hear. Real stories, and take this out of a hypothetical sort of idea about whether this is a good thing, a bad thing, a right thing, a wrong thing. When people are able to really articulate what it is that they want and to be able to support them. In the hospice I was just working in, this was something that was considered part of a continuum of care because it is legal in California. It's something that if people were interested in, that they would have the opportunity to participate in. And I just want to make that clear that there are many hospices that do support this. And the hospice team, in some cases, many hospices support it, but then the hospice team isn't allowed to be in the house, in the room. But there are other hospices, the Mission Hospice, and the one that I worked in, and we have many of the volunteers here, do support patients. They are allowed to have whoever they'd like in the room with them, often, and always a doctor and one of the nurses is there, so that there's a plan B, because the story that you told is wonderful. There are times where that medication works differently, or it has to be delivered in a different fashion. So just to say that, I want to make sure people understand it's really important that you check this out before enrolling in a hospice program, if this is something that's dear to you, and to be very clear about what it is that they are willing to do or not willing to do. So I want to say that. The other thing that I have been so curious about, we talked about this quite a bit when this law came into being in 2016 in California, and the hospice that we were working for opted in to support patients in this way. We really wondered how this changes the experience of dying for people, and how people, and in some ways, and this is not to say that this is not to put this down in any way, shape, or form, but it's a very sanitized way to die. In a, it's very clean, really, opposed to people who are having Cheyne-Stokes breathing, or just their symptoms are kind of playing out over a long period of time. And so our bereavement team and I were just talking about, I really wonder how this changes people's perceptions of dying. And curious if you've done, if part of your research, if there was a way to sort of, I don't know, find out something about that. And I'm not saying that having a clean way to go. I worked through the AIDS epidemic where there were horrific, horrific deaths. And I think everybody that spent any time navigating that knew that there were doctors that were just, there's medication and the person died and there was no investigation of, well, they didn't, that was, where's the morphine gone to? Were people taking morphine so that when they were dying of AIDS, they would have a way out, because the actual way that you would die of AIDS in those days was just horrendous. So I'm just curious about some of those things. And then Julie, I see that you have your hands up, and please do, folks, go to the bottom of your screen, use your reaction key, raise your hand so that we can see those who want to share. And I see some questions up here. Yeah, I see Terry. I'm tracking the chat also, Anita, so thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to, thank you for contextualizing that, Susan. One thing that's really surprising for people to find out is that a lot of the early activism around assisted dying comes directly out of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. A lot of the same folks who were seeing their brothers and sisters die during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and their spouses ended up campaigning for assisted dying. That was often, I've collected many histories on that. That was, it's kind of an unwritten history of the movement that needs to be written, that it's actually, those two causes were very much aligned. And that's how a lot of people got started, and they're still in the movement, and they felt really passionate that this is no way to die. And it's interesting that you say they are sanitized. I describe one case in the book where, and I want to make sure this was extremely rare. This happened. Oregon has now had close to 2,000 assisted deaths. There were 8 people who regained consciousness after taking the medication. And I described the last case, to my knowledge, where that happened in the book. And I just wanted to say it's not representative. In most cases, people do not wake up again. But in that particular case, the science of dying, which I have a whole chapter about in the book, is actually really intricate and complex. And a lot of people are not, people think, oh, it should be so easy to take a medication that will end your life. But if you are restricted to the gastric tract, which is what all the laws that we have in the United States insist that the patient self-administer the medication. And if you self-administer, and there are no IVs allowed, so you can't go through the bloodstream, you can't give yourself an injection, you have to take the medication, it needs to be absorbed by your gastric system. So you can do, you can have a feeding tube, but you have to be able to push the plunger on your feeding tube. You can have a rectal catheter, or you can drink the medication, but whatever you choose, you still have to be that agent that that basically commits this final act yourself. And so because of that, physicians have actually found it surprisingly difficult to find something that would first put you into a coma and then stop your heart and your breath. And there was a question in the chat about how long did it take Jean between when she took the medication and when she fell asleep or passed into a coma. That's usually very quick, between 3 to 5 minutes. So there wasn't a lot of time, and that's why I became especially nervous that she was focusing on me. But as I said, right, your presence changes the dynamics, and that's just what happens in the room. What's interesting about what Susan said, and I just find it so evocative to think about how in some ways an assisted death mimics a natural death. It mimics somebody calmly falling asleep and dying, but you use medication to get to that effect. And of course, it's not always smooth, right? I mean, in that scene that I read, Jean spent what felt like an eternity coughing because it had gone down the wrong pipe. And even when she first started drinking and she said, "Oh, that's so gross," she really needed to finish drinking within 90 seconds. Because if you stop halfway, the medication is not going to work. You might irreparably damage yourself. So even if you find it intolerable or if you have trouble, I mean, the doses is, of course, many times the lethal dose, but you want to make sure that you drink all of it. And but no, things don't always go smoothly. There are sometimes people vomit the medication, or sometimes other unexpected things happen. So it's always a really good idea to have a medical professional there in case something like that happens. But it is interesting to me that it is through medication that we arrive at what looks like a natural death. And this is, I mean, and in this case, what people want most of all, especially those people, you know, who are suffering from a really, really excruciating terminal illness, they at least want their death to be painless. And by everything we know about assisted dying, I think that's something we can say. We don't think that the person, once they slip into a coma, I mean, it's of course hard to say, but it doesn't look like they're suffering because the medication essentially stops the heart. Julie, if I may.
Go ahead. Yep, please.
I want to talk about my late husband and the experience he had with MAID. We live in Ontario, which is in Canada, and so the situation's a little bit different. He was supported by a community-based palliative care team, so it's kind of like, you know, home-based hospice. Very supportive. The physician on that team was not willing to screen him for MAID or administer the medication, but he did refer him to other physicians. And my husband went through the process of there were 2 different interviews that he had to do. I think they had to be 2 weeks apart or something. Anyway, I can't remember exactly. But interestingly, so he had a port in his arm because he had been receiving chemo and daily hydration. He could not drink. So that part wasn't really working well. So he had to receive daily hydration. And this had been going on for months. At any rate, now to the point, he went through the whole process of the screening and signed all the papers, but he did not set a date. And he eventually died without having MAID. He died in the hospital receiving nothing but comfort care, but he was only there for 1 day. At any rate, I think that being able to go through that screening process and know that that was available to him brought him peace. And even though he didn't end up using it, I felt like it had a good purpose. And I just wondered how often that happens. Like, how often do people get ready to do it, but then they're like fine with natural death? That's my question.
Yeah, thank you for that. It happens very often. And so the numbers that we know are that 1/3 of all people, 32% or something, at least in Oregon, and the data are comparable across other states, get the prescription but don't end up using it. And sometimes they die before they have a chance to. And you have to imagine almost all of the people are so close to the end of their life that often they run out of time. If there's a 15-day waiting period, people often die in that waiting period. They don't make it to the end. But a lot of times it's what Julie described. It's an ace up your sleeve. And that's all people want. They know that if things take a turn for the worse and they don't want to keep going, then they don't have to. And I describe a case, and actually 2 cases in the book where that happened to somebody. And in one case, I don't want to totally give it away, but it's in the concluding chapter. Very surprising, an activist who fought years to have this right and didn't qualify because he had Parkinson's, couldn't qualify, ended up getting pancreatic cancer, and then qualified, and then ended up changing his mind. And in another case, a woman who also just wanted to have it available. And it's exactly for the reasons Julie described, peace of mind. It's and a lot of the doctors that I talked to said, it's not a failure if they don't take it. That's exactly what these laws are for. It's giving people that peace of mind. And it's if they don't want to use it, then fine. And nobody is standing there and saying you must use it and or anything like that. So I think it's that in and of itself has been, I would say, a positive collateral effect of these laws, is that it gives people that security that if things are intolerable and hospice doesn't take them all the way, then they have another option, basically.
Thank you so much. They have 2 people that have their hands up. We're going to go to them next, and then I'm going to go back to the chat, and we'll cover some of the questions in there, Anita. And Jeffrey, why don't you go ahead? I'm going to drop you down here with us, and then Brother Joseph will be next after that. And you're muted, Jeffrey. If you could unmute yourself, then we can all hear
Thank you.
Perfect.
That was lovely, Anita. Really appreciate that. Do you have any data as to the differential with regard to families who experience the assisted dying versus families who don't, and the nature of the grieving behaviors that occur beyond? Are there any data available with regard to that?
Yeah, thank you. So there are some data comparing it to traditional hospice deaths, and they're not hugely different. There are some data that suggests that families who went through an assisted death have less complicated grief. So that means they don't suffer this idea from the idea that they didn't get to say something, or that they weren't ready, because you have so much time to prepare, or not so much time. Well, sometimes only 2 weeks, but you know that this is coming. And so a chance to say goodbye. And some of those things can happen on hospice. There aren't, what I would really like to see, and I don't know if there are studies about that, is comparing assisted deaths to ICU deaths, for instance, or unwanted hospital deaths, or that kind of thing. But you can have a home death that very much would fall in line with what an assisted death is, only that you don't know the exact date. So I don't know how specific that is. But one thing that is interesting, and I talk about that more in the book, but a funeral celebrant, she told me what's really interesting is that in our culture, we are so hesitant to say goodbye early. So we don't want to have that be the last time. Well, we don't know when we're going to see somebody the last time. So we're hesitant to then say goodbye, because what if the person lives another week, right? It's almost, it's looked at askance, right, if you do that. And so sometimes families feel like, oh, well, I didn't know she was already going to die, or I would have said all these other things. Say it now anyway, right? And whether or not it's an assisted death. But it's super. I'm
just wondering, in terms of these terrible years of COVID, is there any information around the effect of families not being able to be with their loved one, as opposed to when they can, whether it's assisted dying or not? Are there any data, particularly in a state like Oregon, where there is this available as a legal situation? Has anybody attempted to compare the types of grief or the extremities of grief, or as DSM-5 is now calling it, prolonged grief disorder, sadly, but that's what it is. I just wonder how we could make this so much more greater awareness about this. And I teach psychiatrists at Hopkins, and they know nothing about it. You know, that this is not part of what they get and what they know. So I'd like to be able to say, well, you know, here are some studies that have been going on at the University of Oregon or some other place that have been looking at the levels of extreme grief or prolonged or whatever, so that we can then make a case for this in that way. Have you had any, by the way, contact with any of the people here in Maryland or Washington, D.C. with regard to this approach? You have mentioned a number of states where you have had contact. I wonder.
Yeah. So Washington, D.C. only legalized assisted dying a few years ago, and they have had very few cases so far. So I don't know how it's going. I'd have to look at the yearly report there. I have not seen, so I've read a lot of qualitative studies about what the pandemic has done to grief work in general. And I'm sure in the foundation, you've probably had people come and talk about that, just the ways that people have been alienated from the grieving process, even more so, right, through not being able to go to assisted living homes, not being able to be at funerals, having Zoom funerals and things like that. And what that does to somebody's idea of letting go and of processing a death. Oh my gosh, like, I feel like the pandemic has really like wreaked havoc on our ability to grieve. I mean, and also grieve collectively that we've lost 1 million people. And so I am waiting for somebody to write that book and to come out with that. I don't know that they have done this comparative work, but and a lot of it is unpublished. Like the study I mentioned, that was part of a conference. But I'm sure there's some really interesting things coming out of the pandemic now. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And we will have Dr. Kathleen Shear from the center. It's at the Columbia Center for Complicated Grief. She's a psychiatrist. She's done training for decades around complicated grief, which was so confusing to people because isn't all grief complicated? Yes, it is. But not all grief is prolonged, where the person is stuck in the moment or the moments after the person they love, their beloved, died. And are in a situation where their life basically comes to a stop, and they're stuck in a time and can't sort of, I would say, normal bereavement counseling therapy has not been able to sort of dislodge them so that their normal resilience and ability to move through grief, as all of us can, it's just not triggered. So there's a process, there's an assessment. This prolonged grief we can't really assess for that for more than a year after a death, that the person would consider that prolonged grief. So we're going to have Dr. Shear do a talk about that so that people can better understand that, because it's misunderstood, and also it can be very helpful to people who are stuck like that and have had no luck or support.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to Freud's differentiation between mourning and melancholia, right? Melancholia is mourning without an end, mourning that never is actually resolved.
Yes, and that's not to say that people's grief doesn't go on for a lifetime when their beloved dies, but many people are able to re-engage in life and have that person as part of their life, even though they're not sitting here at the dinner table, for example, with me. But my beloved is still part of my life, and I've been able to reintegrate back in and continue to move forward in my life. And there's people that I know just that is not their experience. So Brother Joseph, thank you for your patience. Thank you for being willing to work with Zoom. And I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself, and I'm going to add you down here. And why don't you go ahead? Thank you.
Joe is fine. I want to be brief because I see there are a lot of questions there. But let me start with great appreciation to Anita and to the organization. I heard Elisabeth in Chicago years ago, read a lot of her stuff, spent a week with her in a life, death, and transition week, which was very powerful, and saw a therapist who was connected with her, spent time working in hospice, and wow, this is just so grateful. Your comments, Susan, Anita, what you have. And I just pulled out Barbara Karn's booklet, which I found years ago. And this is not an answer to what we're saying, but each person approaches death in their own way, bringing to this last experience their own uniqueness. And I am dealing with my own biological brother, whose wife has been in a nursing home, unable to walk, been on hospice, has recently died. And so working with my own brother, I'm a hospital chaplain, so to try to bring your own professional training, plus get out of the way of your personal stuff and all that stuff is not something that everybody has to deal with. But what I'm saying, the universality of the things that you spoke about, Anita, that, for some, and Susan, that you said for some, it can be a lifetime of grieving. Some people get on with it. I had 2 people die close to me. I'm still pissed, both of them, for leaving, although I really understand all that. So maybe I'll cut it short now and just say I'm grateful for the work that the foundation is doing. And Anita, grateful for what you had talked about while I was trying to get ready. I ordered the book, and thank God it's in paperback, or going to come in paperback. And it really helps me inform. I mean, I'm not quite there in terms of assisted suicide, but as a good chaplain, I would be there for people. So thank you for everyone. Thank you for this material. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. And you're actually reminding me, I'm just going to share my screen one more time to show you something. If people want to reach out for anything or want to read more, this is my contact. That's my baby. I had to.
Yes.
But this is a way that you can get in touch with me, and on my website there are resources if you want to hear more about some of the organizations or read who help with assisted deaths and all of these things, or just read about hospice and other things. You can just head to anitahannig.com, and I'm also on Twitter. I'm not sure how many are, but and that's my little baby Helena. Okay.
And Anita, just so you know, that we'll be sending an email out to everybody who's registered for this event with this link to the Zoom, and we'll also have this information. I usually include any information that our speaker would like to have. And Brother Joseph, thank you for your good work. It's very difficult, as you said, when you're supporting people who are dying and their families, and then you're going home and grieving. And I encourage everybody who's in that situation, as many of us are, to, that stuff they talk about, self-care. It really makes a difference. I know that we probably encourage people all day long to do self-care, and then we go home and we don't do any of it. So I'm speaking for myself. It's in my mid-60s now, I'm learning how to do self-care. So Susan, I see your hand up, but we're going to go back through the questions a little bit here. Sky asked at 5, about 20 minutes ago, about, can you describe a way for survivors to describe the death that will help with understanding and acceptance for others?
That's such a great question. I think one is to stop referring to these things as suicide.
Yes.
They're legally not registered as suicide. All the laws that we have actually draw a legal line between assisted dying and suicide. I have a piece that's coming out next week that describes exactly why, and that it's not just a euphemism, and that it's not sanitizing, and why it's legally, medically, philosophically, practically actually a different thing. And in the English language, sometimes we are very blunt. Sometimes we don't have the tools and the nuances to really think about, okay, is this actually a new conceptual and moral category? And do we need a new term for that? I talk about it in the book. I have half a chapter about the differentiation between assisted dying and suicide. But the point is that survivors often feel the stigma that clings to a term like suicide. And this is exactly why they don't share what happens, because they get judged for suiciding or letting their person suicide when we're talking about an end-of-life medical procedure. And up until the 1960s, there were no organ transplants. I'm just going to give an example, because there was no legally, there was no such thing as brain death. So a physician who transplanted an organ from somebody who was technically still alive because brain death hadn't been invented would have been an executioner. And of course, that doesn't make sense to us anymore, right? So the Harvard Committee came up with a new term called "this person is brain dead." and this means that they are no longer alive, and this is why we can harvest organs and things like that. And this is kind of a similar thing here, that initially, early on in this debate, people, the closest the closest frame of reference they had was suicide. And yet when we're talking about suicide, we're talking about a very, very different thing. We're not talking about somebody who is legally pursuing this option. And of course, you have to fulfill all the criteria, which I can just briefly talk about. You have to have less than 6 months to live. You need to be mentally competent. So if you have more than early dementia or any sort of mental, any condition that affects your decision-making ability, you're not allowed to use assisted dying. You have to be over 18. In most states, you have to be a resident, except Oregon. They just changed that. You no longer have to be an Oregon resident to use Oregon's law. That was just changed a couple of months ago. And I'm forgetting a few other things, but those are kind of the main parameters that you sort of fall under. But anyway, sorry, Sky, back to your question.
I was just going to say also, you need to have 2 doctors. So both doctors have to agree that you've met all of those conditions and you have less than 6 months to live.
That's
In
right.
California, there also was a 15-day waiting period between those things. And as you said earlier, many people slipped right through that crack of not being able to use the medication. My friend included, who had worked for 30 years in end-of-life care, and through a bunch of snafus, the doctors say the doctors weren't timely in their getting the medication to her. By the time she received it, she was not able to self-medicate. So they have eliminated that. Now it's a 48-hour period. And
Only in California, yes. In
California.
Oregon, only if you're an extremis. That means
Yes.
if you are very close to dying.
Right.
Otherwise, you still have to do the 15 days. But Sky, just to go back to your question, I think it's stop referring to assisted dying, assisted suicide. When I do a search on Google Trends and you type in assisted dying versus assisted suicide, 9 out of 10 people search for assisted suicide. And so I think there's a larger linguistic cultural shift that has to happen here to actually call this what it is, and to call it is legally by its correct terminology. And a lot of people say euthanasia, and they don't understand that euthanasia is totally illegal in this country. Euthanasia means that a doctor injects you with a medication, which is in one really interesting statistic for those of you who are interested in statistics that I'm always fond of naming. So in Canada, in most provinces, you have the option between an assisted death or euthanasia, where a physician administers the medication. And just as a guesswork, if people want to put it in the chat, how many percentage of people do you think opt for the physician injecting the person versus the person self-administering, like it is in the United States? Ballpark. If you want to put in the chat real quick. No guesses? Okay, 99%.
That would have the doctor.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's quite telling. I don't think we will ever get to that in the next decades. I can talk about this more, but I want to respect everyone's time, and there are so many more questions. But
Yeah.
and I talk about in the book. So if you're curious about why, read this book.
Anita, we also, Compassion and Choices, which has done a lot of work in the United States around this issue, has started referring to this experience as medical aid in dying, with the hopes that they can move it away from the idea of assisted suicide or assisted dying, where somebody thinks that, oh, I can assist my friend by doing this for them, which can be confusing too, and also illegal in this country. So medical aid in dying is what they're referring to it as, and that has been taking me a little bit of time to make that transfer as well. But that, I think, is a little clearer to people about what that is.
Well, because assisted suicide is actually illegal everywhere.
Absolutely.
You can't assist somebody in a suicide, and there are laws about it. And even suicide used to be illegal. It's no longer illegal to end your own life, but it is illegal to assist.
Yes, absolutely. Terry Chapman asked, after all you've learned and experienced, would you have any hesitation to use medical aid in dying or an assisted death for yourself?
I personally would not. I probably would be curious what the newest protocol is before I do it, because of some of the instances that I describe in the book. No, I would not. I have some questions around what will happen with people who are suffering from Alzheimer's,
Yes.
because that is such a tricky issue and one without easy answers. And but I know a lot of people would potentially be interested in that. But how do you ensure consent at the time of when somebody's taking that? Or would you then have to take it when you're still lucid enough, potentially shaving years of your life? So that's a really, really complicated ethical question that I'm hoping some smart people will find some sort of good answers for. But what I feel strongly about is that I think having this option, giving people an option, is what these laws are all about. It's not forcing anybody to do anything, but it's when somebody is suffering from a really extraordinary, difficult and painful terminal illness, to give them some sort of way out instead of staying alive, if against everything in themselves and against their own kind of sense of self.
Thank you. I wanted to say we've had a talk with Phyllis Shafter about a month or 2 months ago, who describes voluntary stopping of eating and drinking. Her husband had dementia, and that is what they opted for because that was something they could do in their own home. And they still had a lot of complications. And it's up on the foundation's YouTube page for anybody interested. Somebody's asking, how do you qualify? And I think you've answered that just now. And somebody else asked about somebody with a neurodegenerative disease or ALS. Is this something that is available to them?
Yes, it is. Although I will have to say, and I talk about this at length in the book, if you have a neurodegenerative disease and you have limited range of use of hands, or you've lost your ability to swallow, there are ways that you can still make use of the loss, but it's more difficult. So you can have, if you still have use of your hands, you can push on a feeding tube if you can't swallow, or a rectal catheter. But because of this act of volition, that this has to come from you, the law actually, a lot of physicians in my book argue that the law discriminates against people with ALS. There's currently a lawsuit in California that challenges that part of the statute that says, can we make an exception for people with neurodegenerative diseases who physically might be shut out of the law because of their limited ability for movement, and who are intentionally discriminated against, basically. And they cite the Americans, what is it, the disability, what is it called?
The Americans with Disability Act.
There it is, yeah. And I don't think they will get very far with this, because then we're venturing into the territory of euthanasia. But it is true that ALS patients, and I describe one very heartfelt one in the book, struggle with correctly judging how much time they have left before they lose all their capacities, just so they can still self-administer.
Thank you. Okay, let me get down here. Canada, across the nation, Ontario. It's done by a doctor from IV. Somebody did guess that Connie guessed 90% to your earlier question about the doctors. And Elaine would like to know if there's time to talk about medical aid in dying and SCOTUS. Important, and what you think about this.
Yeah, so unlike abortion, in 1997, the Supreme Court decided that assisted dying is a states' rights issue. So there's no constitutional right to assisted dying, which at first blush sounds bad, like, oh, there's no constitutional right, but it actually means that each state legislates their own law around assisted dying. And so this is now what's probably going to happen to abortion, but that already happened to assisted dying. So there is, unless there's a Supreme Court, there's a case that goes all the way up to the Supreme Court that could potentially scrap that decision from 1997. It's not that likely that anything big would change right now, but it's also not likely that we would get something like with gay marriage in 2015, where it's just legalized federally. I would not see that happen, not with the current makeup and not anytime soon. And So right now, there have been individual challenges to individual laws in individual states. And then there was actually a time when California's law was suspended a few years ago for a while, and then it was reinstated and things like that. But no, it's not Kavanaugh who wrote a book against assisted dying. It was Gorsuch. Neil Gorsuch wrote something about euthanasia, but it's not legal in the United States anyway.
Susan Haas has been sitting patiently with her hand up for quite some time, which must be exhausting. Here, why don't I'm going to drop you down in here, and if you could, there, you've unmuted yourself. Thank you. Whoops, where did Anita go now? Oh, sorry, I'm going to drop you back in here too. There we go. Susan, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you for your talk. I have not had the opportunity to read your book yet, but I look forward to it. My question may be answered in your book. I don't know. I'm curious if the deaths that you attended were all in private homes, or whether they were ever in a facility such as a nursing care facility or a retirement community, and if there was any pushback in those facilities for what was going on.
That's a great question. Actually, all of the ones I attended were in assisted living facilities. And it's interesting because some of them have no policies for or against assisted dying. So that's the people who died there basically said, well, there's no policy, then technically it's not illegal. But there are some facilities that have policies against it. And finding a place to die can be surprisingly difficult, because in Oregon, you can't do it in a hospital. You can't do it in a public space. A lot of the time, the people who use them are no longer living in their own homes. They've been living in assisted living facilities for a really long time. There was a time early on when not a lot, but some deaths actually happened in hotels because people had nowhere to go. And now there's a list of Airbnbs that allow assisted deaths. So volunteers in End of Life Washington or End of Life Choices Oregon will sometimes help coordinate. There's this Airbnb host that has said they're open to this, but it's surprisingly hard sometimes to find a place to die. I mean, I described one case in the book where somebody was living in a facility that didn't allow assisted dying, and a social worker took him home to her own place to die. So that can be complicated, but now there are also some retirement assisted living facilities that actually have positive policies about assisted dying, or that don't prohibit it. But sometimes families basically say, well, it's, what is the saying? Like, it's better to ask for forgiveness later, or what is it?
It's better to ask for forgiveness later than permission first.
Yeah. I wanted to say something really quickly about, I see something in the chat about palliative sedation. That's something totally different.
Thank you.
So palliative sedation is essentially legal on hospice. And technically, I mean, some people say it's a type of euthanasia because it's reserved for patients with extreme symptoms, with such unremitting symptoms that the only way to make them comfortable is to put them into a coma. And because you're withdrawing hydration and nutrition at the same time, they end up usually dying within 2 weeks. And that's legal on any hospice. I don't know how, maybe Susan could speak to that, how common that is, but it's an option available that doesn't get talked about, but it's completely legal. And the Supreme Court has actually said, yeah, that's totally fine, back in like the 90s.
Yeah, we used to do a number of times in our hospice program where we were unable to get the pain or symptoms under control that was satisfactory to the patient. And a number of times the patient came up out of the sedation, once to thank everybody for helping her. She had a genetic and chronic long-term, she was born with a bone disease where her bones broke constantly. And so she had never been out of pain her entire life. So she woke up to tell us she had finally been out of pain, and she wanted to thank the nurse that was there, and then went back right under again. She was given some more medication. I think since medical aid dying has been available, I think most of the people that would have gotten palliative sedation probably have opted for this instead. And I think that Connie's question, Connie's a nurse, so I know that she knows what palliative sedation is. I think she was trying to clarify in Canada, were you talking about actual euthanasia where the doctor goes in with the intent of, I'm giving you medication that's going to end your life now? Or were they giving palliative sedation so that the disease?
I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah. The latter. I mean, they were going in with the intent. I mean, yeah.
Okay, great. And then I know that we're 1 minute over. I just wanted, there's one last question. I'm very curious about this myself. Were there any spiritual care providers present at any of the deaths you attended or with the families while their loved one was dying that you interviewed?
Not at the ones I attended. I know there are cases of that. You even have, I've heard of examples of priests reciting the rosary at somebody's deathbed, other hospice chaplains being present, other people. The people that I followed were not very religious, and that tends to be sort of the norm around, I mean, at least among the people that I interviewed, they didn't have a big spirituality, but certainly, I mean, if somebody does, it doesn't, and if it doesn't go against the grain of their soul, of their faith, then certainly having a spiritual provider there, it can be very meaningful and can actually help with that ritualistic element that I was talking about.
Yes. Thank you so very much. This has just been remarkable. It's just a wonderful evening. I'm so appreciative to you and your baby. I hope your baby has been cooperative with the babysitter.
I haven't heard her once, so probably.
Thank you so much. And for all of you that are asking, this will be available probably in a few days, and I will send an email via Eventbrite to you all for the link. You're welcome to share that as being posted in a public place. And Anita, thank you so much. If there's other topics you'd like to explore, please feel free to email me. And because we do on the first Tuesday morning of each month, we have a community conversation. And then on the fourth Tuesday evening of the month, we do an author or a movie. So thank you very much. And to everybody that's here, thank you for your time. I'm going to turn off the recording now. I will be staying here for a few minutes. If people would like to just stick around a bit, I'm going to guess that Anita will need to go attend to her baby. But we're going to stop recording now.
A couple of seconds, but I wanted to say something that somebody told me after one reading. They said something like, writing about death is a gift to the living. And I really think that. I really think that's true.
Thank you. It's a beautiful way to end.
Thank you all for attending. I know there are some direct messages. If you have anything, please feel free to email me. And yeah, I need to go bathe and put my baby to sleep.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you all for being with us.